So my message this morning is to not shy away from the things that crack and threaten and raise up in front of us, to not run from the places where there's poverty and despair, to not worry about the narratives that are rooted in fear and anger, and to hold on to the hope that gives us, and not to be afraid to do the uncomfortable things. I believe really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think we are commanded to recognize that if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If someone takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And we are commanded to know the other things people are. I am persuaded that in this country, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. We talk too much about money in America. I am persuaded that in this nation, the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when Micah calls us to do justice, he is calling us to stand with the poor and the oppressed. And finally, I believe that when I come to Pasadena, when I come to Los Angeles, when I come to California, it's a beautiful place. There's so many wonderful things here to see and to experience, but I cannot judge the character of our community. I cannot judge our commitment to these gospels. I cannot measure our progress toward redeeming and upholding those who are poor and afflicted by looking at how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. I think this community, this church, this nation will be judged not by how it treats the powerful and the rich and the privileged. I believe we will be judged by how we treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And it is in that metric that we actually can find ourselves acknowledging what Paul is talking about in these scriptures. I have a very simple prayer. My prayer is that all of you will get proximate to the places where there's suffering and abuse in this community. My prayer is that God will give you the heart and the voice to change the narratives of fear and anger to hope and redemption. My prayer is that God will plant within each of you a hope that does not fail, that does not flee when things are ugly and overwhelming. And finally, I pray that God will call you to do those things that are uncomfortable, those things that are inconvenient, because in doing so, I believe we fulfill Micah's commitment, Micah's call to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God.
In a world often defined by its stark divisions and entrenched injustices, Bryan Stevenson stands as a beacon of unwavering hope and a relentless advocate for human dignity. His message, encapsulated in the resonant phrase, "You've got to be brave, brave, brave," is not merely a call to action. It's an invitation to confront the uncomfortable truths of our society and to actively participate in building a more just future. Stevenson, through his tireless work with the Equal Justice Initiative, has laid bare the systemic inequities that plague the American criminal justice system, revealing how historical legacies of slavery and racial oppression continue to shape the lives of marginalized communities. His approach is not one of detached observation, but of profound engagement. Stevenson's work is rooted in proximity, in bearing witness to the suffering of those condemned by a system that often prioritizes punishment over redemption. He understands that true justice cannot be achieved from a distance. It requires a willingness to stand alongside the vulnerable, to listen to their stories, and to challenge the narratives that perpetuate their marginalization. This commitment to proximity is a radical act in itself, demanding that we confront our own biases and acknowledge the humanity of those we have too often ignored. Stevenson's message is particularly powerful because it acknowledges the paradoxical strength found in vulnerability. He reminds us that true bravery is not about denying our weaknesses, but about embracing them, about recognizing our shared humanity, and about finding the courage to act even in the face of overwhelming odds. He emphasizes that the path to justice is not paved with easy answers or quick fixes. It requires sustained commitment, unwavering empathy, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. In a society where narratives of fear and division often dominate, Stevenson offers a counter-narrative of hope and redemption. He believes in the power of human beings to change, to grow, and to heal from the wounds of injustice. He reminds us that we are all capable of contributing to a more just world, not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through small acts of compassion, empathy, and courage. This introduction serves as a portal into the profound insights of Bryan Stevenson. It is an invitation to explore the themes of bravery, justice, and redemption, and to consider our own role in creating a society where every individual is treated with dignity and respect. Stevenson's message is a call to action, a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be brave, brave in the face of injustice, to listen deeply, to act justly, and to never lose sight of the inherent worth of every human being.
Increased 640% in the last 20 years. There are collateral consequences. 50% of the people in jails and prisons suffer from mental illness. The Bureau of Justice reports that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. That was not true in the 20th century. That was not true in the 19th century. It has become true in the 21st century. What does it mean to do justice in the face of the growing levels of poverty and so much anger and distress? I have 4 words. The first is that I believe to do justice, we have to get proximate to the places where injustice prevails. We've got to get close to the spaces where there's poverty and abuse and neglect. It is in proximity that we understand things that we cannot understand from a distance. We've got policymakers and decision makers trying to solve problems from a distance, and the problem solving isn't effective because they miss the details of the problems. They don't understand the nuances. Proximity is necessary if we're going to really change things. I am the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in a rural southern community where black children couldn't go to the public schools when I was a little boy. I started my education in a colored school. There were no high schools for black teenagers when my dad was high school age. He couldn't go to high school. And then lawyers came into our community and they made them open up the public schools for black kids. And because of their choice to get proximate to poor kids like me, I got to go to high school. I graduated from high school and I got to go to college. No one in my family had graduated from college. I went to a college in Pennsylvania. It was a beautiful campus. I was very active in music. I was very active in sports. I majored in philosophy. I loved college. In fact, after being there a couple of years, I woke up one morning and I said to myself, you know what? I love college. I'm going to stay in college the rest of my life. I called my mom. I said, Mom, I love college so much, I've decided to stay in college the rest of my life. And my mother said, I didn't graduate from college, but I don't think they're going to let you do that. I said, no, Mom, they will. And when I was a senior, I would go out on the hillside and I would think what I thought were these deep thoughts because I was a philosophy major. And I was out there one day and someone walked up to me and said, you're a senior and you're a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college? And I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized that no one was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated. And so I frantically started trying to find a way to stay in school. And I didn't know, what I'm sure everybody in this church knows, I didn't know that if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, to get accepted into graduate school, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. That was pretty intimidating to me, so I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found law school. It was very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. I signed up for that. And a few months later, found myself at Harvard Law School sitting in a classroom disillusioned. Because I went to law school because I wanted to do something about racial inequality. I wanted to do something about poverty. I wanted to do something about social injustice. And nobody was talking about race or poverty or injustice. There was this disconnect. I left the school and I went to the School of Government. I couldn't find anything there. I went back to the law school and I was about to do that thing which I urge none of you to do, where I was going to accept a career, accept a future that I knew was not going to be fully engaged. I knew it was not going to be animating my life. And then I took a course that required me to get proximate to people on death row. And I met condemned prisoners. I met people literally dying for legal assistance. And in their space, in their presence, in proximity to them, I found something compelling, something motivating, something transformational. And all of a sudden, I knew I wanted to stand with condemned prisoners. Proximity gave me power. It made my law school studies purposeful. It changed me, and I believe proximity can change you. Many of us have been taught our whole lives if there are parts of town where the schools aren't very good, if there are places in our community where there's neglect and poverty, if there are sections where there's violence and drug addiction and drug dependency, if there are areas where there's despair and anger, you need to stay as far away from those places as possible. I'm here this morning to preach the opposite. I believe we are actually called to get closer to the places where there's suffering and inequality, to be near those schools where kids are struggling, to be near those people who are drug addicted and drug dependent, to be in those areas where there's frustration and anger, and our proximity will empower us. We don't have to have all the answers. We just need to be close enough that when the answers come, we are there to be a witness. We do justice when we get proximate to the poor and the oppressed. The second thing I believe we are called, if we're going to take Micah's prophecy to heart, to do justice, we have to change the narrative. You see, the problems of over-incarceration in this country weren't created just by policies. Yes, there were bad policies. We decided to deal with drug addiction and drug dependency as a crime issue. We could have said that's a health issue. But we didn't make that choice. We decided to make it a crime issue, and then we put hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons because they are drug dependent. Some countries, like Portugal, said, no, that's a health issue. And they've made tremendous progress, but we decided to make it a crime issue. We didn't do that for alcoholism. We said that people who suffer from alcoholism suffer from a disease. And if we know someone we love or care about, and we see them knowing that they're an alcoholic drinking in a bar, we don't think to call the police. We say that's someone we need to help. But we didn't do that in the criminal justice context for drug addiction. And we allowed this narrative to emerge in this country. It's what I call the politics of fear and anger. Our politicians started competing with each other over who could be the toughest on crime. They wanted us angry and they wanted us afraid. And when you are afraid and angry, you will tolerate injustice. You will tolerate abuse. You will tolerate cruelty. You'll let something inside of you that's afraid and anger temper all of those emotions, those instincts, those commitments to doing justice. We have to change the narrative if we want to do justice. I believe we have to change the narrative in this nation around race. You see, I don't think we're really free. I don't think we're really free. I don't think we've actually been liberated from our history of racial inequality. What we did to indigenous people when white settlers came to these shores was a genocide, and we haven't talked about it. We haven't owned up to it, and it haunts us. What we tolerated during the time of enslavement was tragic. We allowed this narrative of racial difference to emerge in this country. I don't believe that the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude or forced labor. I believe the great evil of American slavery was the ideology of white supremacy that we made up to legitimate enslavement. We said black people are different than white people. They're not as hardworking, they're not as smart, they're not this, they're not that, and because of that, we can enslave them. And we needed that ideology to allow ourselves to still feel moral and just and Christian, and that ideology was the great evil. And we never dealt with it. The 13th Amendment doesn't talk about the narrative of racial difference. It doesn't talk about white supremacy. It only talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor. And because of that, I don't believe that slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism and violence and lynching. We lynched thousands of people in this nation. We put them out on the front of the courthouse lawn, and we burned them alive, and we brutalized them, and we hanged them, and we shot them, and we created this environment where the rule of law did not prevail, and we haven't dealt with that legacy. That legacy haunts us. The black people in Los Angeles and Oakland and San Francisco and Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit did not go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They came to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And we haven't dealt with that. It haunts us. Older people of color come up to me sometimes. They say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear someone talking about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. We haven't dealt with this narrative, and that narrative now has turned into a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. It follows black and brown people. It is the reason why we are hearing people talking about banning Mexicans and banning Muslims with impunity. We're not outraged. We're not undermined in this. We are actually indifferent to this ugliness, and that ugliness is shaped by this narrative of racial difference, and we've got to change the narrative. We should have committed ourselves to truth and reconciliation, but we didn't. In South Africa, there was a recognition that there would not be progress without truth and reconciliation. In Germany, there is a recognition that there will not be progress after the Holocaust without truth and reconciliation. You go to Germany and Berlin, you can't go 100 meters without seeing the markers and the stones placed next to the homes of Jewish families taken to the camps during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to Auschwitz and reflect soberly on that history. In this country, we do the opposite. We don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about this burden, and we are not free. We have to change the narrative if we are to do justice. Third thing, I don't think we can do justice unless we protect our hope. You have to be hopeful. You have to believe things you haven't seen. You have to be guided by a fundamental hopefulness. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists, and if people are not standing up hopeful, injustice will persist. Hope is what will get you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what will get you to speak when other people say be quiet. Without your hope, you cannot do the things that must be done. You've got to protect your hope. When I was a young lawyer, I moved to Montgomery, Alabama. And the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott, an amazing woman by the name of Johnny Carr, called me up and she said, "Brian, I understand you're a young lawyer, just moved to town." I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "Well, my name is Johnny Carr. I'm the organizer of the Montgomery bus boycott. I'm the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And since you are a young lawyer, just moved to town, I'm going to sometimes call you up and ask you to go some places and speak." And then she said, "Sometimes I'm going to call you up and ask you to go some places and listen." And then she said, "When I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, 'Yes, ma'am.'" And so I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she would call me up and send me places and ask me to go speak and ask me to go listen. And one day she called me up and she said, "Brian, Rosa Parks is coming to town. And we're going to get together at Virginia Durr's house." Virginia Durr was a white woman whose husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. She said, "We're going to get together and talk." She said, "Do you want to come over and listen?" I said, "Oh, yes, ma'am, I do." And then every now and then she'd say, "Now, Brian, what does the word listen mean?" And I'd have to explain to her that I knew I wasn't supposed to say anything. And I went over there and I listened to these women talk for 2 hours. And they were in their 80s, and yet they were still talking about not the things they had done, not the accomplishments they had made. They were still talking about the things they were going to do. And there was a hopefulness in their voices. They were telling me to stay hopeful. They were teaching me that all the ideas in my mind, all of the strategies and tactics in my mind weren't going to actually get me any place if they weren't fueled by some conviction in my heart. And it was hope that they were preaching that afternoon. I sat there and I just took it all in, and after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, "Now, Brian, tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me about what you're trying to do." And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And I gave Ms. Parks my rap. I said, "We're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about excessive punishment. We're trying to do something about conditions of confinement. We're trying to do something about mass incarceration. We're trying to do something about racism. We're trying to do something about poverty. We're trying to help the mentally ill. We're trying to help children." I gave her my whole rap, and when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, "That's going to make you tired, tired, tired." And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, "That's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave. It takes courage to be hopeful. But when you find your courage, you actually find the will to say no to all those things that would have us get hopeless about what we can do to do justice." Now, I wish I could stop at 3, but there's one more. I don't think we can actually fulfill this command that we read in Micah to do justice by just getting proximate and changing narratives and being hopeful. I think the fourth thing we have to do is that we've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things, because we really cannot do justice without being willing to do that which is inconvenient and uncomfortable. I have read, I've studied, I've looked for examples where justice prevailed, where oppression was defeated, when people only did what's convenient and comfortable, and I can't find any example of that. I've only seen oppression end. I've only seen justice prevail when people, good people, did the things that were inconvenient and uncomfortable. And it's hard, because we're human. And humans are programmed to seek comfort. We like comfort. I like comfort. I'm not preaching against comfort. I gave a talk down in Mississippi a couple of years back, and when I got to the airport, the people met me there, and they said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We know what kind of work you do. We know what kind of lawyer you are. We know what kind of person you are. And we have to tell you that we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel." They said, "We've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn." I said, "What is wrong with you?" I said, "Of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. I like those cookies just like everybody else." That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to position yourself in uncomfortable places, and you've got to be a witness. I've been representing people on death row for 30 years, and I've had some wondrous moments where we've freed people who were wrongly convicted, where I've seen us prevail in stopping a wrongful execution, but we've also had some difficult days. Between 2009 and 2011, Alabama had the highest execution rate in the nation. We had an execution every other month. There is no right to counsel in this country. One of our great challenges in America is that we have a legal system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And I told my young lawyers to stand down because they looked so beat down by this process that I said, "I'll take the next case." And it was a man who was intellectually disabled. He suffered from mental retardation. And our courts have said you cannot execute the people with mental retardation. So I went to the court and said, "This man is intellectually disabled. You cannot execute him." And the court said immediately, "No, it's too late. You should have said that earlier. Someone should have raised that earlier." And then I went to the state court and they said too late. I went to the appeals court, they said too late. Went to the federal court, they said too late. And finally, the day of the execution had arrived, and I was pacing in my office waiting to hear from the United States Supreme Court. After filing a stay motion, I was pacing back and forth, and about an hour before the execution was scheduled, I got the call. I picked up the phone, and the clerk from the court was on the other line. And the clerk said to me in a very deliberate tone, he said, "Mr. Stevenson, your motion for stay of execution has been denied. Too late." I hung up the phone, and I called this man to give him the news, and he was overwhelmed. He was distraught. He began to sob. I stood there holding the phone, just listening. And then finally this man said to me, he said, "Mr. Stevenson, there's something I have to tell you before you hang up. Please don't hang up until I tell you what I have to tell you." And then this man tried to say something to me, but in addition to being intellectually disabled, he suffered from another challenge. When he got nervous, when he got overwhelmed, when things got too much for him, he would begin to stutter very, very badly. He had a very severe speech impediment that would make it very hard for him to talk. And he had begged me not to hang up until he said what he wanted to say, but he couldn't get his words out. And he kept trying to say something. He kept trying to say something, but he couldn't get the words out. I heard the guards in the background trying to prepare him for execution, trying to speed things up, which just made it worse. And this man kept trying to talk. He kept trying to say something, and the harder he tried, the more he was breaking my heart. I was standing there holding the phone, and tears started running down my face. And he kept trying, and he kept trying, and I just stood there, and I kept crying. And then I remembered how, when I was about 9 years old, my mother had taken me to church one Sunday. And I was there in church with my brother talking to my friends, and there was a little skinny kid I'd never seen before. And I remembered how I asked this little boy, "What's your name? Where are you from?" And this little boy looked very nervously at me, and then he tried to answer my question, but he also suffered from a very severe speech impediment. And when he tried to answer my question, he couldn't get his words out right, and I did something really ignorant because I'd never dealt with anybody with that challenge. I laughed. And my mother saw me laughing, and she gave me this look I'd never seen before, and she came over and grabbed me by the arm, and she pulled me aside, and she said, "Brian, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that." And I tried to apologize, and my mother said, no, you know better than that." And then my mom said, "Now you go back over there and you tell that little boy you're sorry." I said, "Okay, Mom." And I took a step, and she grabbed me by the arm, and she said, "Wait, after you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy." I kind of rolled my eyes, but I said, "Okay, Mom." And I took a step, and she grabbed me by the arm, and she said, "Wait, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him." I said, "Mom, I can't go over there and tell that little boy I love him." And she gave me that look again, so I said, all right. And on the night of this execution, I remembered going over to this little boy and walking up to him and saying, "Look, man, I'm sorry." And then I remembered lunging at him and giving him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I remembered saying to this child as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, "Look, man, I love you." And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back. And then he whispered flawlessly in my ear, he said, "I love you too." And I was thinking about that as these tears were running down my face. And finally, this condemned man said what he needed to say. He said, "Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for representing me." He said, "I want to thank you for fighting for me." And the last thing this man said to me was, he said, "Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life." He hung up the phone. They pulled him away. They strapped him on a gurney. They executed him. I hung up the phone, and I said, "I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. Too hard, too hard, too hard." I was painfully uncomfortable. I kept thinking about how broken he was, and the question I had in my mind is, why do we want to kill all the broken people in this country? What is it about us that when we see brokenness, we want to step on it, we want to throw it away, we want to crush it, we want to hide it? And then I realized that I represent the broken. All of my clients are broken people. They've been broken by poverty, they've been broken by racism, they've been broken by disability, they've been broken by disease, broken. And then I realized I work in a broken system. Too many decision makers and policy makers far away, not proximate enough to do justice. And I said, I don't want to have anything more to do with this. And I sat down and started having that conversation you have when you're trying to make an important decision. And then I realized something I had never realized before. I started thinking about why I'd been doing what I do, and then all of a sudden it hit me. And what I realized in that moment was why I do what I do. And I realized I don't do what I do because it's important. I don't do what I do because it's about human rights. I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. I don't do what I do because it's about justice. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, no one will. I don't do what I do because I get to talk to wonderful people like you. I realized that night why I do what I do. And what I realized is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is, if you get proximate, if you change narratives, if you are required to be hopeful in the face of hopelessness, if you do uncomfortable things, you will be broken. But I also realized that night that there is power in brokenness. It is not the whole and the privileged and the healthy that will lead us to redemption. It is the broken that can teach us what it means to accept God's grace. It is the broken that can show us the power of mercy. It is the broken that will teach us what compassion can do. It is the broken who understand what it means to suffer weaknesses. It is when we are weak and broken that we are strong.
Through his reflections and personal anecdotes, Stevenson illuminates the profound connection between embracing vulnerability and pursuing justice. His message underscores the paradoxical strength found in acknowledging weakness, a concept deeply rooted in the historical resilience of marginalized communities. This strength, forged through centuries of systemic oppression, is not passive acceptance but an active assertion of humanity. For Black communities, as Stevenson emphasizes, it underscores the power of communal support and faith-based institutions, which have historically served as pillars of survival and resistance. Acknowledging generational trauma while celebrating resilience becomes paramount, prompting a critical examination of how to empower those burdened by historical inequities to forge new paths, a path Stevenson himself has tirelessly walked. Stevenson, through his work with the Equal Justice Initiative, rightly emphasizes the critical need for proximity in understanding systemic issues. His direct experiences representing incarcerated individuals illustrate the profound disconnect between decision-makers and the communities they serve, a disconnect that perpetuates ignorance and reinforces harmful stereotypes, particularly for Black and colored majority populations. This distance translates into policies that exacerbate existing inequalities, necessitating a shift from top-down solutions to community-driven initiatives that prioritize the voices of those directly affected. As Stevenson highlights, dismantling the outsider perspective and fostering genuine relationships across racial and socioeconomic lines becomes essential. Understanding the nuances of diverse communities, such as the heterogeneity within the Hispanic and Black populations, and recognizing the historical context of redlining and its impact on wealth and resource access, are critical steps toward meaningful change. Furthermore, acknowledging the systemic disparities within the justice system, including disproportionate sentencing, is imperative, a reality Stevenson has documented and challenged throughout his career. Empathy and narrative change emerge as powerful tools for dismantling harmful stereotypes. Stevenson's call to reframe drug addiction as a public health issue rather than a moral failing is particularly relevant for Black communities, who have been disproportionately targeted by the war on drugs. This criminalization of addiction perpetuates a cycle of poverty and marginalization, demanding a fundamental shift in how we view substance abuse. Investing in community-based treatment programs and alternatives to incarceration, alongside challenging the implicit biases that perpetuate racial disparities in the criminal justice system, are crucial. Additionally, examining the role of media portrayals in reinforcing negative stereotypes of people of color is essential for fostering a more just and accurate understanding, a point Stevenson underscores with poignant examples drawn from his work. Stevenson's reflections on the enduring legacy of slavery and white supremacy necessitate a deep confrontation with the systemic nature of racism, which extends beyond individual acts of prejudice. For Black and colored majority populations, this requires acknowledging the ongoing effects of historical trauma, including intergenerational poverty, health disparities, and limited access to education and economic opportunities. Stevenson's emphasis on listening, exemplified by his accounts of guidance from influential figures like Rosa Parks, underscores the importance of amplifying marginalized voices. For Black and colored majority populations, whose voices have been historically silenced, being heard is an act of empowerment. Creating platforms for these voices to share their experiences and perspectives, and centering the leadership of those directly affected by injustice, are crucial steps. Understanding the importance of allyship and how to effectively support marginalized communities is also essential for fostering genuine collaboration and progress, principles Stevenson embodies through his unwavering commitment to his clients and communities. Stevenson's call to bravery is a demand for sustained commitment to addressing systemic problems like mass incarceration and racism. This requires a willingness to challenge the status quo and disrupt entrenched power structures. For Black and colored majority populations, this necessitates engaging in advocacy and activism, both individually and collectively, holding institutions accountable for their role in perpetuating inequality and recognizing that change is a marathon, not a sprint. are vital components of this ongoing struggle. As Stevenson passionately articulates through his speeches and writings, empathy and compassion serve as the foundation of justice, humanizing those who are marginalized. For black and colored majority populations, who are often dehumanized by stereotypes and prejudice, this recognition of their humanity is essential. Challenging the narratives that portray marginalized individuals as inherently criminal or undeserving, and building bridges of understanding and fostering a sense of shared humanity are crucial steps. Remembering that everyone deserves dignity and respect is fundamental to creating a more just and equitable society, a conviction that permeates Stevenson's life's work. Stevenson's final message, that we are judged by how we treat the marginalized, serves as a powerful reminder of our moral responsibility. For black and colored majority populations, this is not merely a philosophical concept but a lived reality. This demands that we prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable in our communities and actively work to dismantle systems of oppression. Educating oneself on the history of oppression and striving to be a part of the solution are essential components of this ongoing commitment. By embracing vulnerability, cultivating proximity, fostering empathy, and challenging harmful narratives, we can work towards a more just and equitable future for all, particularly for those who have endured centuries of systemic oppression. A vision Bryan Stevenson compels us to embrace. Looking ahead, the path toward a more equitable future for marginalized communities, particularly those of color, hinges on a profound societal shift. It's about dismantling the walls of isolation that have been built, brick by painful brick, by historical injustices and systemic biases. We must commit to building bridges, not just across physical spaces, but across the vast chasms of understanding that separate us. This future demands a radical reimagining of justice itself. We need to move beyond punitive measures that perpetuate cycles of harm, and instead embrace restorative approaches that prioritize healing and reconciliation. It means recognizing that true justice isn't about retribution, but about addressing the root causes of inequity, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, the systemic biases that cast long shadows over entire communities. Changing the narrative is paramount. We must challenge the harmful stereotypes that dehumanize and marginalize and instead amplify the voices and stories that celebrate resilience and strength. This means creating spaces where those who have been silent can finally be heard, where their experiences are validated, and where their leadership is centered. And above all, it requires courage. Not a fleeting burst of bravery, but a sustained, unwavering commitment to challenging the status quo, to disrupting entrenched power structures, and to holding institutions accountable. It means choosing to stand alongside the vulnerable, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's inconvenient. Ultimately, the future we strive for is one where every individual, regardless of their background, has the opportunity to thrive. It's a future where the legacy of oppression is not erased, but transformed into a powerful catalyst for positive change. It's a future built on empathy, on understanding, and on a deep and unwavering belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. And that future begins with each of us choosing to be brave.